So we'll go ahead and get started. Again, as we're reading, we're going to read chapter 3 together. Tomorrow's homework homework for tomorrow is going to be to read chapter 4. We should get through the majority of chapter 3 today. But as we're reading, if you have a pen, pencil, highlighter, I would take that out. Be looking for instances of privilege, poverty, and acts of being closed-minded or open-minded. You know what, Ethan? If you go to the bin over there, there is highlighters. Same with anybody if anyone wants to borrow one. Second.
Underlining things, it really doesn't work.
I got you. How many kids? Hundreds.
That's like most books. It's like $9.
Yeah. We get a discount because we buy so many of them. All right, so chapter 3, it starts out with Scout. Poor Walter Cunningham, first of all. Scout literally is ticked off that she got in trouble at school, and so she decides she is just going to, instead of being mad at the teacher, she's going to take it out on poor Walter Cunningham and rub his nose in the dirt and start wailing on him in the schoolyard. Now, Scout gets punished. Does anyone remember what her punishment is? This is actually a really funny scene, or it's supposed to be. Yes. Yeah, so she tells the teacher that she is shaming Walter. So she's like, Miss Caroline, you are shaming him. Miss Caroline, as we have discussed, does not take that well. And so she hauls Scout to the front of the room, and then she has Scout put out her hand. Now, Scout is used to the only reason you would put out your hand is to make a spit handshake, to be and shake on something. So she's like, what deal are we about to make? And then Miss Caroline comes up, taps her hand with the ruler, but she taps her so lightly that Scout doesn't even realize that she's getting whipped. She's just like, what is this teacher doing? What are we doing right now? And all the kids are she looks at the class, and the class is like, we don't know what's happening. Then when the teacher makes Scout go into the corner, finally they're like, oh, Scout was whipped. And then everyone just dies of laughter as Scout is standing in the corner. But again, Miss Caroline, even in her punishment to Scout, is ineffective because she taps Scout so lightly, Scout doesn't even know she's being punished until she has to go stand in the corner. So anyway, Scout is a little bit embarrassed by this, so she decides, instead of being mad at Miss Caroline, which she already is, but she also takes her anger out on Walter Cunningham. All right, so this is page 30. Catching Walter Cunningham in the schoolyard gave me some pleasure, but when I was rubbing his nose in the dirt, Jem came by and told me to stop. You're bigger than he is, he said. He's as old as you nearly, I said. He made me start off on the wrong foot. Let him go, Scout. Why, he didn't have any lunch, I said, and explained my involvement in Walter's dietary affairs. Walter had picked himself up and was standing quietly listening to Jem and me. His fists were half-cocked, as if expecting an onslaught from both of us. I stomped at him to chase him away, but Jem put out his hand and stopped me. He examined Walter with an air of speculation. Your daddy, Mr. Walter Cunningham from Old Salem? He asked, and Walter nodded. Walter looked as if he had been raised on fish food. His eyes, as blue as Dill Harris's, were red-rimmed and watery. There was no color in his face except the tip of his nose, which was moistly pink. He fingered the straps of his overalls, nervously picking at the metal hooks. Jem suddenly grinned at him. Come on home to dinner with us, Walter, he said. We'd be glad to have you. Walter's face brightened, then darkened. Jem said, our daddy's a friend of your daddy's. Scout here, she's crazy. She won't fight you anymore. I wouldn't be too certain of that, I said. Jem's free dispensation of my pledge irked me, but precious noontime minutes were ticking away. Yeah, Walter, I won't jump on you again. Don't you like butter beans? Our Cal's a real good cook. Walter stood where he was, biting his lip. Jem and I gave up, and we were nearly to the Radley place when Walter called, Hey, I'm coming. When Walter caught up with us, Jem made pleasant conversation with him. A haint lives there, he said, cordially pointing to the Radley house. Ever hear about him, Walter? Reckon I have, said Walter. Almost died the first year I come to school and ate them pecans. Folks say he poisons 'em and puts 'em over the school side of the fence. Jem seemed to have little fear of Boo Radley now that Walter and I walked beside him. Indeed, Jem grew boastful. I went all the way up to the house once, he said to Walter. Anybody who went up to the house once ought to not still run every time he passes it, I said to the clouds above. And who's running, Miss Priss? You are, when ain't anybody with you. By the time we reached our front steps, Walter had forgotten he was a Cunningham. What do you guys think that might mean? By the time we got to our front steps, Walter had forgotten he was a Cunningham. What does that mean? So first of all, what does being a Cunningham most likely mean? Being poor. So being a Cunningham is associated with being poor. So I would mark this, again, we're looking for instances of poverty. The fact that she says he had forgotten he was a Cunningham, which, what does she mean by that then? If we're associating being a Cunningham with being poor, what is she saying here? By the time they got to her house, he'd forgotten he was a Cunningham. What might that mean?
He's getting nicely treated, and that's something he's used to.
Okay, yeah, he's not thinking about his poverty in this moment. He's blending in, he's fitting in with Jem, he's acting, they're both getting along, they're having this nice conversation. So they're not really thinking about class here and the fact that the Finches may be better off than the Cunninghams and his family. Also, if you look on page 30, how do we know that Walter's about to get a meal at the Finches? How do we know that Walter typically does not get fed well? And again, not because his parents are abusive or anything like that, but because his family doesn't have money. What description, if somebody could find the description on page 30 and read a description of his physical appearance to us? Yeah, Isaiah. Well, one, he wasn't wearing shoes. We find that out earlier in the book. Good point. So already, we know, we had talked about in chapter 2 that he did not have much money. What else indicates that he does not eat very well here on page 30? Yeah, Tyler?
It says it looked like he was raised on fish food.
Yeah.
He had red-rimmed, watery eyes, and no color in his face.
Right, yeah, just like his physical description, right? It literally looks like he's undernourished, right? And Scout describes him as looking like he had been raised on fish food. All right. Jem ran to the kitchen and asked Calpurnia to set an extra plate. We had company. Atticus greeted Walter and began a discussion about crops neither Jem nor I could follow. Reason I can't pass the first grade, Mr. Finch, is I've had to stay out every spring and help Papa with the chopping. But there's another one at the house now that's field in size. Did you pay a bushel of potatoes for him? I asked, but Atticus shook his head at me. While Walter piled food on his plate, he and Atticus talked together like two men, to the wonderment of Jem and me. Atticus was expounding upon farm problems when Walter interrupted to ask if there was any molasses in the house. Does anyone know what molasses is?
It's like honey.
It is, but it's real. Has anyone tasted molasses? It's good when you put it in things, but on its own, it's very thick, very sugary, not, in my mind, very tasty, thick syrup. And so he asks for some molasses. She stood waiting for Walter to help himself. Walter poured syrup on his vegetables and meat with a generous hand. He probably would have poured it into his milk glass had I not asked what the Sam Hill he was doing. The silver saucer clattered when he replaced the pitcher, and he quickly put his hands in his lap. Then he ducked his head. Atticus shook his head at me again. But he's gone and drowned his dinner in syrup, I protested. He's poured it all over. It was then that Calpurnia requested my presence in the kitchen. She was furious, and when she was furious, Calpurnia's grammar became erratic. When in tranquility, her grammar was as good as anybody's in Maycomb. Atticus said Calpurnia had more education than most colored folks. When she squinted down at me, the tiny lines around her eyes deepened. There's some folks who don't eat like us, she whispered fiercely, but you ain't called upon to contradict 'em at the table when they don't. That boy's your company, and if he wants to eat up the tablecloth, you let him, you hear? He ain't company, Cal. He's just a Cunningham. Hush your mouth. Don't matter who they are. Anybody sets foot in this house is your company. And don't you let me catch you remarking on their ways like you was so high and mighty. You folks might be better than the Cunninghams, but it don't count for nothing the way you're disgracing 'em. If you can't act fit to be at the table, you can just sit here and eat in the kitchen. Now, Scout here, and I think we can highlight a lot that kind of goes with these big ideas. Scout here says he's not company, Cal. He's just a Cunningham. What does she mean by this? He is not company Cal, he is just a Cunningham. What is Scout realizing at age 6 already about the town and about her family and Walter's family? What is she realizing? I want you to talk about this with each other. Talk about what she means by he's just a Cunningham, and what does it show us that she already understands as a young child? Go ahead, take a minute, talk.
Or she's treating him like a pawn in society. Like it's like, oh, he's not an actual member of society. He's a poor person. He has poor things. He's poor. Did you hear me? He's poor.
So does she see herself and Walter as being equals?
No.
No. Obviously, how does she view her family versus the Cunninghams?
She thinks she's better.
Yeah, basically she's saying like, oh, he's not like me. He's not like us. And I think even you were kind of getting at this when you first said it. It's almost like she's seeing him as this charity case. Like, oh no, he's not company. He just is some kid we invited over for lunch because Jem felt bad for him. He's not like us. He is an other. He is not one of us. So this could be definitely an instance of being closed-minded. But I also challenge us to see like where Scout's privilege comes into play here too. So if you look on page 32, where it's talking about him pouring molasses all over his food, why might he be doing this? Why might he dump molasses all over his food? It seems kind of gross to us. This would be like you going home, mom cooked spaghetti, and you're like, hey mom, the molasses please, and then you just dump it all over your food. Your mom would probably have the same reaction as Scout. However, what is Scout not understanding here? Yeah. Or actually, I just asked 2 questions. Let's go back to the first one. For Dill, or excuse me, not Dill. For Walter here, why might he be pouring molasses all over his food?
Well, first it's sugary, and maybe the other half doesn't have sugar, and you need sugar for your body.
Okay.
And also another part is like, he's really just trying to put as much food as he can get in his stomach.
Okay. So either way, so maybe it's he's trying to get as many calories in as possible. Molasses, high calories, lots of sugar, lots of carbs, right? So maybe he's trying to consume as many calories and carbs as he can because clearly he does not get a meal like this very often, right? So he's just eating to sustain himself. What might be some other reasons he dumps molasses all over his food? Yeah.
They don't have that.
Yeah, maybe it's something he never gets, so he just wants to have it, right? It could be that. It could also be maybe his food is so bland that they want to add calories when he's at home, and he adds molasses to everything at home to add some extra calories because that's something they can afford. We don't know exactly why he does it, but we know that whatever the reason is, it has to do with his family does not eat like the Finches. They're poorer than the Finches. And this meal, right, which is something that's very standard for the Finches, is something that he doesn't usually get to enjoy or to eat, right? But does Scout understand that? Does Scout understand that? No. So, like, this would be an instance on 32 that I would mark in reference to, like, Scout's privilege here, and this would be a good scene to come back to if you're going to end up writing about privilege. Because Scout clearly is blinded by her own privilege, is unable to see why Walter would do something like this or like feel any empathy for him. She just right away is like, ew, syrup on your meat and your potatoes and your vegetables. Like, this is just gross. She's unable to put herself in his shoes and think through why he would be doing this in the first place. And Cal tries to scold her, but it doesn't seem to be getting through to her. Calpurnia sent me through the swinging door to the dining room with a stinging smack. I retrieved my plate and finished dinner in the kitchen, thankful, though, that I was spared the humiliation of facing them again. I told Calpurnia to just wait. I'd fix her. One of these days when she wasn't looking, I'd go off and drown myself in Barker's Eddy, and then she'd be sorry. So this is very similar. Did any of you threaten to run away when you were little? Okay, similar concept, right? She's like, you know what? You yelled at me, so I'm going to go drown myself. She has no intention to drown herself. She's just being dramatic. Besides, I added, she's already gotten me into trouble once today. She had taught me to write, and it was all her fault. Hush your fussin', she said. Jem and Walter returned to school ahead of me. Staying behind to advise Atticus of Calpurnia's inequities was worth the solitary sprint past the Radley place. She likes Jem better than she likes me anyway, I concluded, and suggested that Atticus lose no time in packing her off. Have you ever considered that Jem doesn't worry her half as much? Atticus's voice was flinty. I have no intention of getting rid of her now or ever. We couldn't operate a single day without Cal. Have you ever thought of that? You think about how much Cal does for you and you mind her, you hear? I returned to school and hated Calpurnia steadily until a sudden shriek shattered my resentments. I looked up to see Miss Caroline standing in the middle of the room, sheer horror flooding her face. Apparently, she had revived enough to persevere in her profession. "It's alive!" she screamed. The male population of the class rushed as one to her assistance. Lord, I thought, she's scared of a mouse. Little Chuck Little, whose patience with all little things was phenomenal, said, "Which way did he go, Miss Caroline? Tell us where he went. Quick, D.C. He turned to a boy behind him. "D.C., shut the door and we'll catch him. Quick, ma'am, where'd he go?" Miss Caroline pointed a shaking finger not at the floor nor at a desk, but to a hulking individual unknown to me. Little Chuck's face contracted, and he said gently, "You mean him, ma'am?" "Yes'm, he's alive. Did he scare you?" So literally, the teacher shrieks. They think there must be a mouse, but she's like pointing at a human child. She's like, "No," and she's pointing to this kid sitting there, and the little boy is like, "Yeah, that boy's alive. Did he offend you? Did he harm you in some way?" Now we're going to see where her fear is coming from. Miss Caroline said desperately, "I was just walking by when it crawled out of his hair, just crawled out of his hair." Little Chuck grinned broadly. "There ain't no need to fear a cootie, ma'am. Ain't you ever seen one? Now, don't you be afraid. You just go back to your desk and teach us some more. Now, a cootie is crawling out of this kid's head. What do they mean by cootie? What does this kid have? Not fleas. In humans, fleas would be called lice. The kid has lice. A louse, is a louse the singular? I think that might be a louse. So a louse crawls out of the kid's head, and we're going to see him just grab the louse between his fingers and then just smush it in front for everybody to see. But she is completely taken aback, whereas everyone in the class, you know what, maybe lice is more common here. They don't seem too appalled by it. Little Chuck Little was another member of the population who didn't know where his next meal was coming from, but he was a born gentleman. He put his hand under her elbow and led Miss Caroline to the front of the room. "Now, don't you fret, ma'am," he said. "There ain't no need to fear a cootie. I'll just fetch you some cool water." The cootie's host had showed not the faintest interest in the furor he had wrought. He searched the scalp above his forehead, located his guest, and pinched it between his thumb and forefinger. Miss Caroline watched the process in horrid fascination. Little Chuck brought water in a paper cup, and she drank it gratefully. Finally, she found her voice. "What's your name, son?" she asked softly. The boy blinked. "Who, me?" Miss Caroline nodded. "Burris Yule." Miss Caroline inspected her roll book. "I have a Yule here, but I don't have a first name. Would you spell your first name for me?" "Don't know how. They call me Burris at home." "Well, Burris," said Miss Caroline, "I think we'd better excuse you for the rest of the afternoon. I want you to go home and wash your hair." From her desk she produced a thick volume, leafed through its pages, and read for a moment. "A good home remedy for Burris. I want you to go home and wash your hair with Lyle soap. When you've done that, treat your scalp with kerosene." Now, does anyone know what kerosene is? It's like gasoline. So, yes, it would kill the lice, but it also probably kill, some brain cells. So this is not a modern treatment. This is like an old-fashioned home remedy. If you ever get lice, do not go put kerosene on your hair. They make shampoo for that now. But she offers this to him. But again, much like the Walter situation, is she having this one-on-one conversation with this boy? She is calling him out in front of the whole class and being like, "You know what? For your lice, take care, this is what you need to do." Now, his response is, "What for, missus?" "To get rid of the, cooties. You see, Burris, the other children might catch them, and you wouldn't want that, would you?" The boy stood up. He was the filthiest human I had ever seen. His neck was dark gray, the backs of his hands were rusty, and his fingernails were black, deep into the quick. He peered at Miss Caroline from a fist-sized, clean space on his face. No one had noticed him, probably because Miss Caroline and I had entertained the class most of the morning. "Ann Burris," said Miss Caroline, "please bathe yourself before you come back tomorrow." The boy laughed rudely. "You ain't sending me home, missus. I was on the verge of leaving. I done my time for this year." Page 36. Miss Caroline looked puzzled. "What do you mean by that?" The boy did not answer. He gave a short, contemptuous snort. One of the elderly members of the class answered her. "He's one of the Yules, ma'am," and I wondered if this explanation would be as unsuccessful as my attempt. But Miss Caroline seemed willing to listen. "Whole school's full of 'em. They just come the first day every year and then leave. The truant lady gets 'em here 'cause she threatens 'em with the sheriff. But she's given up trying to hold 'em. She reckons she's carried out the law just getting their names on the roll and running 'em here the first day. You're supposed to mark 'em absent the rest of the year." But what about their parents? Again, she's having this conversation about a kid in the class with another student in the class in front of the entire class. So not a good thing, but so literally everybody's listening to this. "Ain't got no mother," was the answer, and their paws right contentious. Burris Yule was flattered by this recital. "Been coming to the first day of first grade for 3 years now," he said expansively. "Reckon if I'm smart this year, they'll promote me to the second." Now, we find out a little bit about the Yule family, and this would be an important thing to mark because the Yules are going to come up later in our book. What do we find out about the children in the Yule family? How often do they go to school? They only go to the first day every year, and the truant lady is just tired of dealing with it, and so she's like, if I can bring them here, get them on the roll books the first day, then she just lets them miss school the rest of the entire year. I mean, we'll talk more about why they let them do this, but again, it's against the law for them to be doing this, but they just kind of let this family break the law, it seems. And Burris, who you think would be embarrassed by this recital, is just like, yep, my dad's a trash ball, and he is like very proud of this recital that his classmate is giving about his family. Miss Caroline said, "Sit back down, please, Burris." And the moment she said it, I knew she had made a serious mistake. The boy's condescension flashed to anger. "You try and make me, missus." Little Chuck Little got to his feet. "Let him go, ma'am," he said. "He's just a mean one, a hard-down mean one. He's liable to start something, and there's some little folks in here." He was among the most diminutive of men, but when Burris Yule turned toward him, little Chuck's right hand went into his pocket. "Watch your step, Burris," he said. "I'd soon as kill you as look at you. Now go home." Burris seemed to be afraid of a child half his height, and Miss Caroline took advantage of his indecision. "Burris, go home. If you don't, I'll call the principal," she said. "I'll have to report this anyway." The boy snorted and slouched leisurely to the door. Safely out of range, he turned and shouted, "Report and be damned to ye! Ain't no snot-nosed slut of a school teacher ever born could make me do nothing. You ain't making me go nowhere, missus. You just remember that you ain't making me go nowhere." He waited until he was sure she was crying. Then he shuffled out of the building. Soon we were clustered around her desk, trying in our various ways to comfort her. He was a real mean one. Below the belt. "You ain't called upon to teach folks like that. Them ain't Maycomb's ways, Miss Caroline, not really. Now, don't you fret, ma'am. Miss Caroline, why don't you read us a story? That cat thing was real fine this morning." Burris Yule, thoughts? Cool kid? I mean, we don't like Miss Caroline. We already said that. Not the best, not a great teacher. She's kind of, yells at a first grader for being able to read. Not the greatest. However, probably first day of school, first day of teaching ever, getting called a slut by a first grader, not a great way to start things, You feel a little bad for her, maybe. Anyone feel bad? No, just me? Just me? Maybe some of us? Okay. Anyway, so rough first day for Miss Caroline here, but again, remembering Burris is going to be something you want to make sure you're doing because the Yules are going to come up again. let's just go ahead. We're going to get a little bit further, and then we're just going to pause for the day, and then you'll just finish up. Miss Caroline smiled, blew her nose, and said, "Thank you, my darlings," dispersed us, opened a book, and mystified the first grade with a long narrative about a toad frog that lived in a hall. When I passed the Radley place for the 4th time that day, twice at a full gallop, my gloom had deepened to match the house. If the remainder of the school year were as fraught with drama as the first day, perhaps it would be mildly entertaining. But the prospect of spending 9 months refraining from reading and writing made me think of running away. By late afternoon, most of my traveling plans were complete, when Jem and I raced each other up the sidewalk to meet Atticus coming home from work. I didn't give him much of a race. All right, we're going to go ahead and stop there. The remainder of the chapter, we do find out a lot about the Yules, we find out, Atticus gives Scout some advice that's going to be important for us as we continue the story. So if you would, mark page 38 in your books. That's where we're stopping. You're going to want to finish the rest of the chapter, and then for homework, I had assigned us chapter 4 as well. So that's going to be 38 to 54 is what it's looking like. Okay, so try to get through